Great. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for checking in live with us tonight. Some of us are based here in Philadelphia, some in California, and others coming in from all over the world. We're super excited tonight to have Dr. Vincent Williams, who is an assistant professor in the English Center, in the English department, as well as a writing specialist at the Drexel Writing Center. And he's here to present and give some guidance on how to do a lit review, and then we'll have a really, hopefully, very good Q&A session at the end. We also have online tonight Molly, who is our fantastic TA, who's also available tonight as well as throughout the rest of this course to help out with your lit reviews, and Dr. Chavez, our capstone coordinator, who will be providing, again, more backup support, especially as you move your chapters 1, 2, and 3 to the IRB application. It's great to see you all tonight. So at this point, I'm just going to turn it over to Dr. Williams. I'll just remind everyone to turn your microphones off. And then at the end, when we have Q&A, you can ask a question via the microphone or via the chat box down to the bottom. Thank you.
Okay, I will take over. Good evening, everyone. I'll make one small correction. I'm an assistant teaching professor. I'm all about the teaching. But besides that, thank you for having me. And tonight we are going to talk about the literature review. I know Dr. Kelly said we're going to have a Q&A at the end, but certainly throughout the presentation this evening, if someone has any questions, you can go ahead and type it in the chat box. And between slides, occasionally I'll just go ahead and ask if anyone has any questions. So, you know, I'm looking forward to this being hopefully more of a discussion than a lecture, but we'll see how that goes. So let's go ahead and start. Before we get into it, let's just go over exactly what we're going to do this evening. First, we're going to define and articulate the purpose of the literature review. I think, you know, it's good to sort of pull back and get sort of a macro view of the literature review and why we do it and why it's important. Then we're going to talk about the rhetoric of the lit review, and by rhetoric we're going to bring in some of the composition aspect of the literature review and talk about speaker and audience and messenger. After that, we're going to talk about the look of the literature review. We'll talk about a couple of literature reviews across various disciplines, and we'll use what we call the party metaphor, which I think is a really clear way of illustrating how the conversation is supposed to take place in your literature review. We'll talk about different strategies to organizing your research. We'll look at the non-linear part of the process, which in my mind is something that I think is a great tip. And then finally, speaking of tips, there are a couple of tips that we have found over the years as we have conducted this workshop that will keep you motivated and sane. And finally, there are a couple of resources that I would like to share with everyone. So, what is a review of the literature? We have these three sort of definitions. First and foremost, it's a gathering of the most critical voices in the field on the issue you've chosen to explore. So this is really the research part of it. When you're working on your project, your thesis, your dissertation, your big hoo-ha, the first thing that many of us do as students is we go out and we see who else has written on our subject. And that's the first really, important part of the literature review. And as we'll talk about later, just because you get this huge listing doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to use everyone that you get. But, this first part, it really is you just sort of gather everything together. Second, you really do, for lack of a more elegant term, you really engage into some compare and contrasting between those voices. What is What is Scholar A's view on your subject? What is Scholar B's view on your subject? Do they agree with each other? Does Scholar C build on Scholar A? So on and so forth. And then finally, after you've articulated this analytical dialogue between those voices, what you find is that a unified message begins to emerge. And it's up to you to articulate that unified message and talk about how do they combine to create meaning around that topic. The other really important aspect of the literature review is that it's rhetorical, in that it establishes a foundation for constructing your ethos as a writer who is sending a message to a specific audience within a specific context. So what does that mean? What it means is that as the graduate student, and you're writing to your professors, you're writing to your mentors, you're writing to your peers, and frankly, soon when you're on the job market and you're presenting your packages to potential employers, you have to establish your ethos or your credibility as a scholar, as an academic, as a professional. The literature review is an amazingly important tool to do that, because what the literature review does is that it shows that you know what you're talking about, that you've explored what's already been covered in the field, and that you have an opinion on it. And the message is, I am part of this conversation. I know what's been said. I know what hasn't been said. Here's where I think I can contribute to this ongoing conversation. And again, while the audiences may be different, your graduate work is going to be different than when you actually send out your package, looking for a job. There are similar audiences, and this audience shares the language that you are engaged in because all of you are in the same discipline. So the literature review is a great tool to really start that conversation or to keep that conversation going. Your rhetorical situation, again, just to expand on that last slide a little bit. You're the new researcher, you're a student, you're a developing professional, a prospective employee who is adding your voice to that conversation. Your reader, again, your committee, other scholars in the field, many of whom will be represented in your literature review. And I have to say, it's always a little disconcerting when you're writing. I know when I was putting together my own literature review, and I was citing people that then I was talking to at a conference or in an interview. But these are the scholars in your field, so you have to talk about them in this context. And then finally, the all-important hiring committee. Your message. Why are you doing this research? Your answer to this research question. And then finally, the imprint you make in the conversation. And then finally, the aspect of the rhetorical situation that's important in the literature review is that you're really talking about the state of the field, the present time that we're living in, whether it's a cultural context, whether it's the state of the country or the world, or whether it's the expectations of the textual genre. Again, all of this goes towards serving as a foundation for your credibility as a professional. You know what you're talking about. You know who you're talking to. You know what the situation is that we're in. And most importantly, you have something to add. Does this make sense so far? Anyone have any questions or anything that needs to be clarified a bit? I will take the silence. Oh, wait, it looks like I have a, okay. All right, Anne-Marie says very clear. Excellent. Makes sense. Well, it's always good to make sense and agreed. All right, awesome. Let's keep moving. Sounds good. Love the new way of thinking about it. Ada, I hear you. I was mentioning before we began, I was talking to Dr. Chavez and Dr. Kelly. I'm a big proponent of the literature review in this context where we actually use it as a codified tool that we hand out to graduate students. Because I know in my own graduate experience, I basically had to reinvent the wheel. So I'm so happy that that you find this useful so far. So what does a lit review do? Again, it helps you to get a thorough understanding of the conversation on your topic. You're doing primarily research. You're going out and you're gathering this information. You're reading the information. You're going back and forth, comparing, you're contrasting, you're looking for patterns, you're looking for who's built on one another, all of this. But then it also helps you to carve out a space in that conversation to ask an important, useful research question. We're going to talk about this in a few more slides when we actually get into the party metaphor. But it really is, when you think about your discipline, a really simple way to think about it is that this is an ongoing conversation. It started before you began, and hopefully it'll go on after you're finished. But you're now entering in the conversation. And just like any conversation, it's good to sort of listen before you break in and you say anything. And then when you break in, it's good to have something to actually add to the conversation. For your reader, it provides this foundation of knowledge upon which you will be building your research, which you'll find with your committee members, with your mentors, with your potential employers, is that sometimes you know more than they do about this. So that this gives you a nice central document that both of you can build on and both of you can refer to. And then, and I know the presentation keeps coming back to this, but it's amazingly important when you're beginning in your field as a professional. It helps to construct your ethos. It shows your audience that you know who the most critical voices on your topic are. It helps to show that you know what you're talking about. And it establishes this exigency. It tells the reason why you're doing this. I know, back to my own graduate experience, sometimes I used to turn in a draft of some of my writing, and my chair used to hand me back drafts, and every now and then she'd write on the side, "So what?" And it was so frustrating when she'd write, "So what?" But what she was doing was forcing me to articulate why I was writing, what I was writing, and why it was important. And the literature review, again, helps you to really articulate the reason why you're doing the research that you're doing. So, what does it look like? Well, it depends on your field. Your literature review is going to look different than my literature review, which is going to look different than another person's literature review. The best way to find out what it looks like is to become acquainted with the literature reviews in your field. And I think all of the suggestions under this are magnificent, and they seem very straightforward. And if you're like me, you may not have thought about it, but here it is. Have a one-on-one conference with your advisor to discuss expectations. Always a good idea. Always a good idea to talk to your committee, to talk to your chair, and see what is it that they really expect from you. Review other students' lit reviews. Drexel has a wonderful dissertation archive, and I am fairly sure that you can get access to the dissertation archives at Temple and Penn and Villanova. I know I looked at some dissertations. And, model your lit review after people who've done it already. Study the lit reviews of books and articles in your discipline. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. So, if you want to know what a lit review looks like, look at some lit reviews. Gather your observations and analyze. What patterns do you notice? I think the great thing about academic writing in a specific discipline is that there's usually a fairly small number of scholars writing about what you're writing about, the more specific you get. And those patterns do pop out. Articulate what surprises you about those patterns and about those observations. And then know yourself. What's going to challenge you about this project now that you've actually gotten a handle on what it is that you're going to do? Having said that all of them look different, there is a general format. Generally, the literature review will spill out of the introduction to the larger text. The introduction will discuss the research question at hand. Again, everything that we've talked about, the context. What does the field look like? You know, the exigency for the research question. Why have you decided to address this question? And then finally, you give a preview. What's the text intend to do to arrive at the answer? Lit review includes a selected group of sources that offer a foundation for the proposed research question. Now then, if we were in a classroom setting and I was writing this on the chalkboard, I would underline selected 3 times right now because I'm going to come back to that. The selection process is almost as important as the initial research process, in my opinion. The writer organizes the sources thematically, analyzes the sources individually, and synthesizes the relationships between the sources. And then finally, you close with a discussion of the status of the issue as illustrated by the review of the literature. The conclusion should provide a transition from the research that has come before into the new research that the writer is offering the conversation. Again, it establishes your credibility, it shows your ethos, it says that you've done your legwork, it says that you know what you're talking about. This is where the field is right now. This is what's lacking in the discussion in the field. And this is what I'm going to add to the conversation. Again, not all lit reviews are the same. These are just 4 examples of journals that you can look at, and they have different types of lit reviews. I'll also have I'll have a slide later on that has a couple of resources you can look at for lit reviews. No matter the discipline, however, a literature review is a selective party. And now here we go with the party metaphor. You determine the reason for it. You plan it. You invite the guest. You keep the party alive with interesting dialogue, important debate, etc. As the party wraps up and becomes clear where the rest of the text is headed, it helps you to construct your reputation, and the lit review gives your guest a significant intellectual payoff. So, just to go back to you invite the guest. Your initial research, again, you're going to go out and, you know, at this point, everybody listening to this, you all are at this stage of your career, you all are very good students. There's no question in my mind. And everyone in here can research with the best of them. So you go out and you do this research and you gather 100 different texts. Just because you have 100 texts does not mean that you have to have 100 citations in your literature review. It is up to you, because it's your party, it's your project, to go through, look at the sources, see which ones work for you, which ones, as it says, keep the party alive. Again, to go along with this metaphor, I'm sure everyone listening to me knows a lot of people. But depending on the type of party that you're having, a family gathering, a football party, a costume party, a child's christening, there are some people that you invite to some parties, there are some people you invite to other parties, and then there are some people that you don't invite to any party. You just sort of know them. So you start going with the list, or rather who to invite. And you have the A list. Again, the sort of I guess the best way to put it is the blessing and the curse about our work at this level is that you very quickly find out who the stars are in your field. And you just follow the patterns. You just follow it back. And you say, who started the conversation on this topic? For instance, I wrote my dissertation on a black feminist writer named Octavia Butler. And when I'm looking up Octavia Butler, people have pretty much been doing scholarship on Octavia Butler for the past 25 years. And when you read all of the criticism on Butler, it always goes back to, oh, nice, excellent, Chris, we had to talk. It always goes back to Sandra Govan. And Sandra Govan is pretty much the acknowledged first critic, or the acknowledged first important critic to really talk about Butler. So she has to be considered when you are writing a literature review on Butler. What does the latest research suggest? Same thing. You just find out who's the hot scholar, who's the person that's really writing about him, who is cited the most in the literature. Which voices seem to be in contention with one another? Oh, we scholars do like to get into polite arguments with one another, don't we? And it's very easy to find the scholars who very politely disagree with one another. And likewise, which voices seem to agree. And depending on what your project is, depending on the direction of your project, you pick and choose from this list, you know, from the all-stars, and who you want in your literature review. Having said that, sometimes it's nice to find the quote-unquote quieter voices in the conversation. You know, the scholar who wrote a couple of articles in the small journals, but they have some really radical ideas, and you think they deserve more attention than they've gotten. Again, this is your party, so that you decide who's going to come. So, we've talked about getting your research. How are you going to launch your research? First, when you begin exploring the field for the research, you'll need to organize it. Dr. Kelly told me that many of you have already begun an annotated bibliography. Perfect. The annotated bibliography is a wonderful tool. I think one of the things that I'm really happy about in the first-year writing program is that in the final class, we talk about the annotated bibliography. And it's a fantastic tool. You know, you're summarizing, you're evaluating the sources, you're categorizing the sources. So let's hear about the color-coded note cards. Again, I wrote about Octavia Butler, and if you look at Butler, in a lot of ways, the research on Butler is broken up into three different prongs. You have the feminist criticism, you have the racialized criticism, and then you have the genre criticism. So you have people who write about Butler as a science fiction writer. And when I was putting together my project and I was gathering all of the material, I very quickly realized that it was getting out of control and I needed to kind of mark it. So, you know, I think I had orange for the feminist criticism, blue for the race criticism, and you know, I think I had yellow for the genre science fiction criticism, because you know, as you start burrowing into the library and digging into the research, it all piles up and you kind of forget how you do it. I know I have colleagues who use Post-its. I have, you know, as it says on here, the color-coded note cards. Whatever works for you, but I do think it's a good idea to start early and often kind of color coding and categorizing so you don't get lost in it. Assembling your guests. Again, this party usually is more than a gathering of individuals. The most memorable parties are those in which the conversation is active. Your discipline will determine how lively it is. So active is a nice word, is a nice way of saying it is nice to have some sources that kind of push each other, if you will. No matter what the discipline you will need to make your guess, the sources matter to each other. So again, compare them. How do the sources agree? Contrast. What are the points of tensions? What are the debates? And then under this contrast, I think this is amazingly important. Are these debates important debates? Do you think that these are actual debates that should be occurring, or are people just sort of marking their own territory? How do the sources build on one another over time to push the research forward? And then finally, these two most important questions within the context of your own project. Where do you see the uncharted territory in the literature? Where do you see the unanswered questions? I think for many of us, this is the challenge when we're putting together a thesis project, when we're putting together a dissertation, when we're putting together this final big piece that now we are saying we have a contribution to the field. We're looking for something that hasn't been said already. So when you're putting together this literature review, when you're looking at the arguments and the debates, when you're looking at how people build on one another, slowly but surely, you begin to question the pieces, and you say, well, what about this? Well, you didn't really acknowledge this. And those are the moments that you can begin to articulate your own question. Speaking of which, how are we doing? Any questions? All right, I like a nope. All right, let's keep going. Again, if anyone has any questions, certainly feel free to pop in. Components of the process. As you sort through and peruse your research, your ever-sharpening understanding of the conversation will help you to formulate your research question. Again, is there this gap in the research? Here's a good one. Do you see an opportunity to settle a debate? Is there a question that no one seems to answer? You're part of this conversation now, so certainly you don't need permission to answer the question. Oftentimes, the freshest eyes are the best eyes. On the other hand, is there a problem that has been overlooked that no one has talked about no one has talked about at all? Once you've developed your research question, you will decide which sources you're using and how you will arrange them in the review. As you gather the sources, you will cultivate and sharpen your awareness of who you're writing to. Again, this ever-present audience. But you have to let go of the linearity of it. The two main stages of the process will happen one after another, and then simultaneously, and then in reverse order. Authentic research means allowing new information to change the shape of your inquiry. New research makes you smarter about the conversation, but it also inspires you to ask new questions. So, this is the process. You know, I think one of the sad ironies of graduate work is, I don't think I'm talking out of school by saying this. It takes a certain personality to succeed at graduate school. I think it's fair to say that when you enter graduate school, when you decide that you are going to approach this topic at this level, we're all, we're fairly A-types. We're a little anal retentive. We like things in order. I suspect that if I looked in the offices of many of the people hearing this, all of your pencils are all gathered together and they're color coordinated, and it's our nature. The irony is this process is very much a chaotic one, but in a good way. This is the way we want it. The first part of it. We have a problem, we have a literature review, Then we have the methods that we establish from the literature review, which will then get us results. But what you'll find, as the last slide said, is that the more research you do, it'll make you fold back, and you'll redo your question. And then you'll find other research. And then that research will make you think about your earlier research differently. And then you might rewrite your question. And it goes back and forth and back and forth. And that's okay. That is part of the process. This is not going to be an orderly process. That is the nature of this intellectual exploration that you are engaged in. And it's cool. So don't panic. I love the fact that that's actually on the slide. Don't panic. But it's so true. Make space in your mind to accept the fluidity of the process. Again, I know for many of us, it's not our nature, but you got to do it because you really are. It is this, you'll be going back and forth until this order just emerges. Don't wait until some mysterious endpoint in the research to start writing the literature review. Now, this is something that speaks to me personally because I think I was guilty of what I'm about to say. I think for many of us, we almost hide in the research. Like we like doing the research. We like going and finding new things and almost going on a scavenger hunt. But it's not going to come to a point where now suddenly a box is going to open. Go ahead and start writing. Begin writing as soon as you start to see some of the sources you definitely want to invite. Let the accumulation of this new information shape and reshape how you discuss these sources in the lit review. And let the lit review help you define, broaden, and refine your own awareness of your audience. So, again, just to use my Sandra Govan example, I felt like I knew her differently by the end of my process than I did at the beginning. Because, again, I would read different articles that she wrote. I read articles that referenced her. I read articles that disagreed with her. All of this so that, again, it defines, it broadens, it refines. As Dr. Kelly says, we always have to remind ourselves to trust this process, even if it's messy. I would say especially since it's messy. Here's an example. You might begin here. A, B, and C are all agreeing. So, you have these sources and they write. D raises this new question. E and F disagree about D's point. G's position still doesn't make sense to me. As you revise, you clarify and you problematize. F as most cutting-edge perspective in the conversation, but it also builds on E's data and A's fundamental theory. B is important as in C, but F is the one that has really revolutionized things. The question that D raises is still unanswered, and F tries to answer it but cannot. And that's the important thing. When you find the hot shot, when you find the voice that is sort of the one that we've all decided is the smartest guy in the room, and she can't answer it, this is where you can come in with your research. A couple of tips to keep you motivated and sane. Always remember, you've likely never done anything before that involved this kind of heft of writing and this kind of independence and solitude. It's okay. I think once you again, the irony is that those of us who become graduate students were good students, so we get used to hearing back from the teacher. We like the gold stars, and we like the A's, and we like the check pluses, but you are now moving into a part of the process where you're not necessarily going to get that type of encouragement as often as you want to. You are on your own. You're meant to prove something with this text. You are ready to move from the student to one of the masters. I mean, you know, this is the moment. You're ready to wrestle intellectually with scholars and show that you're prepared to take on this more advanced work, and that this program that you've been through has taught you well. Now we're going to read this third point, and, you know, do with it what you will. Keep your workday to 5 hours minimum. Writing is exhausting. Don't overdo it. You know your strengths. You know your weaknesses. I will say I think we should always think of this process as a marathon and not a sprint. And there are many, 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 many people who have burned themselves out by pushing too hard. So find a good pace and then do your best to stick to it. At the end of each work session, stop in the middle of a project, write a little bit to yourself to prepare for the next session. Then when you go to open up the document, you'll be in the middle and anchored, as opposed to having to start a whole new part at the beginning of a work session. I think that's a great idea. I think it's a great idea, and it really cuts down on that sort of warming up period, if you will, that many of us go through when we come back to write again. So, you know, you leave yourself a little note. Again, you don't, you know, you finish. You stop writing maybe in the middle of a sentence, and then you come back and you finish it, and you finish the paragraph, and that way you can keep going. Here are a couple of resources that I think everyone should have, and Dr. Kelly has a copy of this if you don't write this down. The Purdue OWL is the greatest thing ever. Purdue University, their writing center is pretty much the standard for writing and composition resources. And this link actually goes directly to their literature review page. So, you know, I think the Purdue OWL is great for many things. You know, I'm not sure if you all are using APA or MLA or the Chicago Manual of Style, but the Purdue OWL has a resource for any type of citation that you would use. And again, this is a direct link to their literature review page. University of Wisconsin-Madison also has a wonderful literature review document that will come in handy, I think, and is very, very useful. And then finally, just to toot our own horns, right here in Drexel, you know, the Drexel Writing Center, we have faculty advisors, we have peer readers, we have an online process that people will look at your literature review and talk you through it. And this is the link to go in and make an appointment, to either come in or set up an online appointment. And, you know, again, it really is a wonderful resource. And I would say one of the greatest perks of being a Drexel student, that you have access to this, to the Writing Center. Thank you for your feedback. That's the thank you for your feedback slide that you always have to put. Oh, that's the works cited page. Any questions?
Well, I'm already so excited. I want to go start a lit review right now. So thank you, Dr. Williams. That was really a wonderful presentation, really one of the best I've ever heard. So I feel really honored that you were able to come tonight to our session. So, and everyone, please pop your questions down in the chat box. Click on your talk button if you want to ask a question, even if it's about your own lit review or, you know, whatever.
I do have a question. This is Ada.
Okay, hi, Ada.
Hi. The tone of how you write, the formality of the writing. I listened to you present tonight, and you've calmed me a little bit. It makes it feel a little more refreshing. But okay. I personally tend to get more conversational and less formal when I write. So when I read where you're talking about this is a conversation, how conversational should this writing be?
Well, I like to think of it as a really nice dinner party. Maybe maybe a dinner party. You know how if you've ever been out with your boss or with your professor, or if you had to go to dinner with your parents, that conversation. I think it's the rules of academia that we all see, and I think certainly in your experience you've seen this. You can tell who's the highest on the totem pole by how casual they are. Mm-hmm. And the lower we are on the totem pole, the more formal we have to be. Because again, this helps to establish your credibility as a scholar and an academic. So, I would always lean towards more formal than not.
Okay, makes sense.
Okay. All right, and then Anne-Marie says, I'm finding it difficult to get through all of the literature organized. Oh, okay, I appreciate it. Oh yeah, I'm a huge fan of different color highlighters and Post-its. I always say I realized that I had finally finished, not when I got hooded, not when I passed my comps, not when I actually defended, but when I gave all of my highlighters to my daughter. Like, I had all of these different highlighters, and I finally said, okay, I'm finished. And I handed her a pile of highlighters, and that's when I said, okay, now I am finally finished. So do I typically organize things by author or more by topic? I was a topic person. Again, the way my project was, you had people who wrote and who write about Butler in sort of very specific ways. So, depending on what chapter I was working on, I knew which pile to pull from. But I think the important thing to note is that was my process. And I think you have to sort of figure out what your style is and what works best for you. Chris uses, put your paper and Post-it. There you go. We all just look like Russell Crowe in Beautiful Mind. Post-it notes on and then pick the books. So yeah. This is where everybody is sharing all of their crazy habits with their books.
Dr. Williams, if you were to give one tip on how to get started, assuming that they've all got their a lot of literature read already, and a first draft of a lit review that's really much more descriptive, summarizing the literature, what might be a first step you would suggest?
I would actually find some examples of your research that don't agree with one another. I find that it's sort of easy to start the process by having, Scholar A and Scholar B, and they don't agree with one another, and then start to line up people along those, who agrees with Scholar A, who agrees with Scholar B. And then as you go through it, what I find is that it becomes complicated very quickly. So that Scholars C and D align under Scholar A, but Scholars C and D also disagree with one another. And then it kind of goes from there. And I think that the best place to usually start is the beginning. Really just sort of follow the path and find out who was the first and or the most important scholar in your field. And we all know the way this works is that people respond to that. So that's how I would start.
That's really helpful, actually. One of the things I often hear people people talk about is following the footnotes or following the bibliography. Can you explain what that means in terms of doing a lit review?
Right. You'll have to tell me, do you use MLA or APA?
We use APA.
Style citation.
APA.
Okay, and if I remember, APA is actually organized chronologically, correct?
Yep, that's right.
Right. Start at the bottom. Start at the earliest text. And then, again, see who has responded to that text. And then kind of go from there. You know, and again, I think, you know, not to be reductive, but I think a lot of academic scholarship, you can break it down to I agree with him or I disagree with him. And then you just sort of go from there. Luke wants to know, is there a typical length before you just find yourself going on and on? Luke, I think the biggest or the best answer I can get to that is just model ones that have come before you and sort of see what the standard length is, because it really is different from discipline to discipline.
I'll just add in a...
But if you're able to...
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry?
Go ahead.
Oh, no. I was going to say, if you all are local, I would, take a couple of hours and spend it in the library and look at some dissertations. Oftentimes, people's dissertations will have the lit review at the beginning in some form, either in an introduction or as it'll actually say the literature review, and just sort of model yours after theirs as far as the structure. Other folks?
Well, if there are no other questions, oh, good, another question from Gianna.
What would your best piece of advice for this? Honestly, don't panic. What I wish someone had told you before. You know what? I hate to say it, but I wish someone had told me about all of this. I really did sort of reinvent the wheel when I did my own. I think the best piece of advice that I wish someone would have given me was to actually go and model mine after what others have written. I think for many of us who are new in the field or newer in the field, they sort of they kind of just drill it in our brains. You don't plagiarize. You have to have original work. And I know in my case, I was almost scared to look at other people's work. But in a lot of ways, that is a wonderful practice to kind of see what other people were doing. So I wish someone would have told me that it's okay to see what other people have done and see how they've done it. And I wish someone would have, given me the permission that I didn't need to start writing when I felt it was time to write and not wait for some magical point. I know in my own process, what I found myself doing is, I would read these articles, like we talked about in the presentation, and I would have an internal dialogue with the article, and I would say, well, that doesn't make sense. Or, well, that does make sense, but I think you should take it a little further. And, what I found when I looked through my notes at the end is like my Post-its and my highlighting and my notes at the beginning were sort of they weren't as fluid and as well articulated as they were after a couple of months. Because after a couple of months, I started to have my own language. I started to have my own understanding. I found myself, I would read an article and I'd write, well, see this person, or this person doesn't say this. And those are the times that instead of writing on Post-its or, keeping notes in a notebook, I should have started to write. So I guess those are, you said the best. Those are my two best. Model, look at other literature reviews, and go ahead and start writing when you feel like you have something to say. Don't wait for that magical moment where you feel like, okay, I've read enough now. Because it is an ongoing and messy process. Other questions? Or comments? Or queries? Or responses that start with the sound?
Dr. Williams, Professor Chavez,
yes.
I just want to again highlight what you pointed out in terms of really finding time to go to the library. I think that's an excellent suggestion. We have excellent librarians at Drexel University that are there to assist you. And I think that's an important, advice that I know as a student, as I went through this journey. It was through talking to researchers, folks in the library, that they were able to really help in that whole process of being able to organize and synthesize your literature. So thank you very much for that.
Oh, absolutely. And yes, Ada, I am available through the Writing Center. I actually do the faculty online consultation. So yes, I'm absolutely available.
If there are no other questions, then Dr. Williams, I cannot thank you enough for your
no
sharing
problem. It was my pleasure.
Your expertise and your enthusiasm and your stress-free presentation. So I'll remind everybody who's online that we are recording this and it will be archived. It should show up in the archives by tomorrow night, I believe. So you can watch it again and go back to the points that you want to review. And we'll encourage those who weren't able to make it to, of course, watch this and then reach out to Dr. Williams and the Writing Center for any support and help you need. Thank you so much again, and thank you to all of you for coming in tonight.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. And good luck.